Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, where we are reading the book It Must Have Been an Angel by Marjorie Lewis Lloyd. This book is a collection of true stories related by persons who had angelic encounters, as well as other providential tales of divine interventions compiled from various Christian publications. In our last reading, we covered chapters 9 through 11, where the author made us to understand that these stories are not for entertainment, but to strengthen our faith and deepen our conviction that with God, all things are possible. She showed us how many biblical miracles have been replayed in modern life, such as when an Adventist pastor, his wife, and a converted Jewish young lady were accosted by an angry crowd led by a big angry man who started beating the pastor. Miraculously, the crowd parted, and they passed through unnoticed, as Jesus had passed through the crowds wanting to stone him or throw him over a cliff. Or, like when Dwayne and his wife were about to have a head-on collision, then suddenly and inexplicably found themselves in the parking lot of the restaurant to which they were driving. In chapter 10, we learned incredible stories of faith, such as George Muller, who prayed with the captain of the ship that the intense fog would lift in 5 minutes, and it did, not because of presumption, but because of Muller's deep and abiding faith that God wanted him to be at the appointment that God had set up for him. Or even more incredibly, of the prisoner in the Eastern European communist country who was challenged by a police officer and a doctor to drink a glass of poison to prove that he believed the word of God in Mark 16:18, which said, "If they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them." To frighten him to giving up his faith, a small portion of the poison was given to a big dog, which died almost instantly. But after a beautiful prayer for his family, the police officer, the doctor, and himself, glorifying the name of God, he drained the glass and suffered no ill effects. His faith was so dramatic and the miracle so astounding that the doctor tore up his Communist Party card and took up the Bible and claimed that from that day he would serve Jesus. And finally, in chapter 11, the author shared some of her own experiences to show that God not only works in the big things, but also in the small everyday things, even like changing the borders on a booklet of poems that already had been published, or delivering an important package on Sunday when the express office claimed that no package had come through. We continue these marvelous angel stories today with chapter 12, entitled The Touch of Angel Hands. David Duffy, his high fever in its second day, had just asked Daisy to get down the big medical book and look up bubonic plague. Daisy looked at her young doctor husband in terror. Bubonic plague? You don't think it's the bubonic plague, do you, David? She read aloud from the book, her voice trembling. Bubonic plague may be carried by infected rodents. Incubation period 1 to 6 days. Onset of illness is sudden, usually accompanied by high fever. The first swelling appears on lymph node nearest site of inoculation. Generalized swelling throughout lymphatic system follows. Disease is endemic to the Lake Titicaca area. Everything fitted. On Monday, David had finally secured permission to remove his medical books from the rat-infested warehouse in Puno, where they had been stored. Friday afternoon, a slight swelling under his left arm. That evening, a temperature of 104 degrees. Just a bad case of flu, he thought. Saturday night, the swelling now general. He first noticed the tiny telltale scratch on his hand and remembered the rat-infested warehouse. That's when he became suspicious. Daisy read on silently through stinging tears. A crisis to be reached 5th or 6th day after onset of illness. Can expect either improvement or turn for the worse. Little hope after patient is in coma stage. Coma deepens until death. But then as she read on, there was a little hope. Sulfadiazine in large doses sometimes helpful. Anti-bubonic serum if given early in the course of the disease. Of course, anti-bubonic serum. She fairly leaped to her feet. She would start the sulfur immediately. She would cable Lima for the serum. Dr. Potts would come from Lima. Everything would be all right. The cablegram was sent. It read, Dr. Duffy, bubonic plague. Send anti-bubonic serum. Urgent. Please reply. Then she waited. Waited for the serum. Waited for the fever to drop. Waited for Dr. Potts to come. Waited for everything. Sunday passed, and Monday. Tuesday morning, and still no word. In the meantime, she did everything she could, but nothing brought down the fever or relieved the pain. On Tuesday afternoon, however, there seemed to be a change. David was quieter and in less pain. He could even sleep some. It seemed the crisis had passed. Daisy was relieved, until she realized what it all meant. The change was not for the better at all. David was beginning to slip into a coma. Now she sent a second cablegram, this time paying extra so that it would be delivered to Dr. Potts' home and signed for. Later, she would learn that the first cablegram was never received at all. The second was promptly delivered to his home and signed for at the door by the maid. Dr. Potts was not at home, and the maid put the urgent cablegram in a top dresser drawer where the doctor found it 2 days later. Wednesday morning, David could not take food or swallow. It was difficult to arouse him. Soon, he was completely unconscious. At 2 p.m., the clinic personnel gathered for special prayer for their doctor. And then Noel, the Argentine nurse, started out in his little Ford for the secondary school 7 kilometers away. He would bring back a group of ministers and teachers for a special service of prayer and anointing. Daisy, at 2 o'clock, was sitting at David's bedside. She could scarcely discern his breathing, and she noticed that fluid was beginning to form on his lungs. The words of the 23rd Psalm flashed into her mind. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. But in her despair, she couldn't help asking silently, is God with me in this hour? Does he hear? Why, oh why, has he not sent help? At that moment, there was a knock on the door. It was Marcelino, with a word of an emergency at the clinic. A patient was hemorrhaging, and Noel was gone. Could she please come? She told Marcelino to sit by the bed with his hand on David's pulse, and let her know instantly if there was any change. She hurried out. The emergency was serious and took longer than she had expected. 45 minutes later, she rushed back into the house. Marcelino was sitting on the sofa in the living room, nonchalantly leafing through a National Geographic magazine. She was indignant, and she was terrified, both at once. Why had the usually dependable Marcelino disobeyed her instructions? Why was he in the living room? Had the terrible moment come while she was gone? The boy was utterly mystified at her outbreak. Hesitatingly, he tried to explain why he had deserted the doctor. "The doctor told me to go out," he said simply. "The doctor told you?" She choked now. "The doctor hasn't spoken for 2 days." She couldn't say another word. Tremblingly, she pushed open the closed door, terrified at the thought of what she would find. The bed was empty. In front of the dresser stood David, fully dressed, his stethoscope in hand. "David Duffy? What are you doing?" she gasped. "Oh, I thought I'd better go over to the clinic and make some rounds," he said pleasantly. "Haven't seen the patients for several days, have I? What day is it anyway?" When the troubled little group of teachers arrived at 3 o'clock for the special prayer and anointing service, they were ushered into the clinic consultation room for a time of special thanksgiving. Dr. Duffy sat at the desk. A look at Marcelino's careful notes revealed this. 2:20, doctor turned over in bed. 2:25, he asked me what I wanted and told me I could go. It was 2:20 that Noel had reached the school with the sad news. The men had immediately dropped to their knees. Where is the angel in this remarkable story of healing? Interestingly enough, this is what we read from the servant of the Lord. The miracles of Christ for the afflicted and suffering were wrought by the power of God through the ministration of the angels. And it is through Christ, by the ministration of his heavenly messengers, that every blessing comes from God to us. In the case of David and Daisy Duffy, all human help had failed. Cablegrams had been no help. The medicine had not come. The doctor from Lima had not come. But the unconscious doctor and his despairing wife were not alone. They were not without help. The touch of angel hands, directed by the great healer, had restored David instantly to health. The experience of Nanton, a boy of New Guinea, is equally remarkable, though very different. When a messenger burst into the village of Papua with word that the government patrol was approaching, the people fled in terror. They had never seen white men before, and they were taking no chances. Mothers scooped up their babies, and everybody, young and old, disappeared into the bush or up in the mountain. Everybody, that is, except Nanton. He couldn't go because he was crippled with leprosy. So when the patrol officers trudged wearily into the village, they found houses empty, cooking fires still burning, and Nanton. Imagine, if you can, his absolute terror as a strange white man in a big hat bent over him and examined him. Within a week, the boy, who knew nothing of the rest of the world, was put aboard a strange aircraft and taken to a leprosarium on the coast. There he was operated upon and sealed in plaster from the soles of his feet to the top of his hips. Think of the trauma of it. No friends. No one could understand his language. He sat alone on his bed day after day, unable even to feed himself because his arms were so deformed. It was in this condition that an Adventist pastor found him and became his friend. He brought him food and clothing, and slowly Nanton learned to speak pidgin. Now the pastor could tell him about Jesus, and how he restored the paralytics and healed the lepers. He told him that Jesus is the same today. And the boy believed. 3 months after the plaster was applied, it was cut away. But his joints were still weak and twisted. His left leg was badly ulcerated. It was a terrible disappointment. Now he must be encased in plaster again, this time for 6 months. But the pastor encouraged him to keep trusting. He told him Jesus still could heal him. And Nandis believed it was true and kept on praying. On the second Monday night, after Nandis was sealed and plastered the second time, he had a dream. In his dream, a tall man in shining white stood by his bed and said to him, "Nandis, it's time for you to get out of bed." He said, "I can't. Look at me." But the man said kindly, "You can. Give me your hand." Nandis held out his wasted hand, but the man said, "No, open your fingers like this." "It's not possible. You see, my motor nerves have died and my hand is permanently disfigured." That's what he had heard the doctors say. "If you take my hand, your own will straighten." And in the dream, it was so. Then the man in white said kindly, "Now, come, get out of bed." So in his dream, Nandis swung his legs over the side of his hospital bed and stood up. "Go for a walk." And he strode off down the ward. When he came back to his bed, the man in the dream said to him, "You have been sick a long time since you first believed, yet your belief in me hasn't wavered at all. Tonight, I have taken away your leprosy and have restored your movement. Now, I want you to work for me." Nandis said he would, and thanked the man profusely as he turned and left the room. Not long after that, the boy was awakened by the sound of a patient down the ward calling out. A nurse turned on the light. It was almost dawn anyway, and Nandis decided to say his morning prayer. But in the midst of the prayer, he remembered his dream. Nandis opened his eyes and could hardly believe what he saw. His fingers were straight. He opened both hands several times. It was easy. He examined his formerly twisted arms. He could move them. Next, he felt for his legs. He was happily shocked to discover that the plaster had all crumbled away. The sores had healed, and his joints were strong and firm. Overjoyed, he slipped out of bed and fell to his knees. How could he thank his Lord enough? When a male nurse passed by, Nandis called him and showed him his hands and his legs. The nurse was astounded at the sight of Nandis standing. The nurse called the other patients to come and see. Excitedly, they crowded around him. But some said he shouldn't have removed the plaster. When the doctor came, He cleared that up, however, telling them that it was utterly impossible for Nandis to remove the plaster when he couldn't even feed himself. The doctor examined the boy and said, "I think your God has something to do with this." X-rays of his legs were proof of his remarkable healing. Blood tests were negative. Nandis was cleared to return home. But he said to his doctor, "The Lord said I should work for him, but I really don't know what kind of work I should do. Can you give me some work?" So Nandis was put to work in the physiotherapy department. That was the beginning. Soon, he was transferred to an Adventist hospital, was baptized, and married a lovely Christian girl named Rebecca. Yes, angels are often sent on missions of healing. But sometimes, the healer is so moved with compassion that he takes charge himself. The end of chapter 12. Chapter 13. They also care. The Wyman family were in Calcutta at the time. Ruth was 3 years old. She doesn't remember anything about the experience in which she was involved. But this is the story as her parents told it to her. They were living on the top floor of an apartment house, probably the 3rd floor. Her parents had a Bible study appointment with the family down on the 1st floor that evening, and for some reason, they had no babysitter. Since they would be in the same building, they left Ruth alone, but checked now and then to be sure she was all right. Before the study was over, however, they heard a noise outside the apartment door and went into the hall to check. There at the foot of the stairs was little Ruth, with one hand high in the air, as if holding someone's hand. "How did you get down here?" they wanted to know. And she said, "The angel brought me." Again, Ruth remembers nothing about this. She knows only what she was told. Any parent knows that small children sometimes have vivid imaginations. And for a 3-year-old to negotiate stairs would not seem too unusual. However, this particular stairway, Ruth was told, was in total darkness and would have been dangerous for a child. Did it happen? Or was it only a child's fantasy? I don't know, but one thing is certain. It is the sort of thing an angel would do if a child were in danger. Angels, as they minister to us, are not doing a duty distasteful to them. They're not simply carrying out an assignment. Angels care too. Angels record our prayers and our tears. If we weep through discouragement, they cease to sing. The first tear of repentance for sin creates joy among them. And listen to this. The angels of glory find their joy in giving love and tireless watch care to souls that are fallen and unholy. Heavenly beings woo the hearts of men. They bring to this dark world light from the courts above. By gentle and patient ministry, they move upon the human spirit to bring the lost into a fellowship with Christ, which is even closer than they themselves can know. Think of it. Angels work to bring us into a relationship with Christ that is even closer than they themselves can know. What unselfishness! Why are angels so interested in us? In this speck of a world, the heavenly universe manifests the greatest interest. For Jesus paid an infinite price for the souls of its inhabitants. Angels care because Jesus cared enough to die for us. We are told that when the news of man's fall reached heaven, angels were so interested for man's salvation that there could be found among them those who would yield their glory and give their life for perishing man. But the transgression was so great that an angel's life could not pay the debt. Nothing but the death and intercession of God's Son would pay the debt and save lost man from hopeless sorrow and misery. Angels care too. Is it any wonder then that angels are kind? Is it any wonder that they delight in doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves? Kind things, thoughtful things, needed things, taking the hand of a little child in danger, or filling the wood box for a woman who could not fill it for herself. It happened in a little cabin in Anchorage, Alaska, on a cold February morning. Mrs. Louise Dubé was alone and so badly crippled that she could not walk without applying hot and cold treatments to her leg. The cabin was heated by a wood-burning cook stove. She had many friends, but this morning, for some reason, no one had remembered to visit her and bring in a fresh supply of wood. And she couldn't call anyone because she had no telephone at that time. In her desperation, she began to pray aloud. Never before had she prayed so earnestly, but no one came. Finally, the last of the wood was gone, and the fire went out. It was 30 degrees below zero. The cabin began to chill rapidly, and she knew that even protected as she was by blankets, she would soon freeze to death unless someone came and brought in wood for her. She kept praying, but no one came. And then she prayed a different kind of prayer. She told the Lord that if it was His will that she freeze to death, it was all right. She was willing. About that time, the door opened. The cabin had only one door. And in walked a tall young man carrying an armload of wood. He was not dressed as most people dress in Alaska during the winter months. He had on a black hat and a black overcoat. He put the wood in the wood box and proceeded to make a fire in the stove. When the fire was burning well, he put water in the big tea kettle and placed it over the fire. All this time, he seemed to keep his face turned so that she could not see his full face. He turned now and went out the door, returning shortly with another armload of firewood. She still had not really seen his face, nor had he said a word. Naturally, Mrs. Dubé was awed by all this, so much so that she could not speak. She just sat there and looked at him, all the while wanting to ask him if he was an angel, yet afraid to speak up. Finally, she asked him that question in her mind, without saying a word aloud. And when she did that, he turned toward her, smiled, and nodded his head. His face was so noble, she says, that she knew he was not from this world. He turned, opened the door, and left without saying a word. For a time she just sat there as if petrified. Finally she thought, If he's an angel sent from God, there will not be any footprints in the snow outside the door. So she forced herself to hobble to the door, opened it, and looked out on the unruffled snow. There were no footprints. Neither had the snow been disturbed over or around her little pile of wood. The snow was perfectly smooth and rounded over, as always after a snowstorm. In the heavenly school, every redeemed one will understand the ministry of angels in his own life. The angel who was his guardian from his earliest moment, the angel who watched his steps and covered his head in the day of peril, the angel who was with him in the valley of the shadow of death, who marked his resting place, who was the first to greet him in the resurrection morning. What will it be to hold converse with him and to learn the history of divine interposition in the individual life of heavenly cooperation in every work of humanity? I can hardly wait. Can you? The end of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Touching the fringes. No book prepared by human hands could ever hold the full record of angel activity on behalf of fallen men. All around this planet, these heavenly beings, 24 hours a day, are protecting, guiding, comforting, encouraging the adopted children of the King. Only occasionally are we privileged to see them. Silently, unobserved by human eyes, they note the prayers of repentant sinners and still not perfect saints. And then, directed by God, they use their incredible power to alter circumstances, to batter down the mountains of difficulty, or to encourage and strengthen us in our waiting. Our prayers have been heard. But do we realize how often angels are involved? It will take a fascinating piece of eternity to tell the full story of these celestial beings we seldom see. In these pages, we can only touch the fringes. But now, a handful of nutshell accounts of what God does with the assistance of angels when we pray. 2-year-old Ray was lost in a cornfield. There was a river nearby and a lake and a creek. It would soon be dark. Nearly 20 people had joined in the search but had found no trace of the little boy. His mother pleaded, "Help us, Lord. Help us find him before nightfall." Finally, helpless to know what else to do, his father dropped the reins on old Nellie's neck, grasped the saddle horn and cried aloud, "Oh, Lord, direct this horse to Ray." Instantly, she started in a swift canter up along the creek bank. About a quarter of a mile to the north, the creek made a loop, and here she started to leave the creek and follow a path across the field. Then the mare stopped dead still, as if an unseen hand had pulled on the reins. Nellie turned and walked straight into the thicket. They were within 20 feet of Ray when his father saw him. But the horse didn't stop until she could have touched him. There he sat, calmly stripping leaves off a stalk of switch cane. His little face was tear-stained, but he was unharmed. His father knelt beside him and offered a prayer of thanks. Then he put Ray on the saddle and swung up beside him. As the horse galloped, he called out, "Found! Found!" and the searchers relayed the happy news from one to another. As his mother, overjoyed, pulled him from the saddle, he called out, "Mama, Big Kitty! Pat Big Kitty!" Many bobcats were found in southeast Missouri that year, 1939. Could it be that the 2-year-old boy had been in the company of a bobcat during those hours? His mother thought so, for he talked about the big kitty for days. Ray had a story he was too young to fill in. One day, his guardian angel will tell what really happened. Ruth Gibson, in the summer of 1977, was alone for a few days while her husband Fred attended a convention. She was a little nervous about being alone in the house at night, especially since a neighbor's house had just been burglarized. Also, the Gibsons had a broken window that had not yet been repaired. But the first evening, she prayed, turned out all the lights, and went to bed about 8:30. The next morning, her neighbor said to her, "Who was all that company last night?" Ruth explained that she had no company, that she had turned out all the lights and gone to bed early. And her neighbor said, "I looked over at your house several times last night, and it was all lit up. Looked like every light in the house was on. I thought you must have a lot of company." Who turned on the lights? Was she in special danger? Did she have company that she was not aware of? Were the house lights turned on at all? Or had her neighbor seen the light radiating from Ruth's angel protector? Someday, she will know. It was early in 1953 when a series of evangelistic meetings was in progress in Reno, Nevada. The presentation of Bible truth, as it sometimes does, aroused some opposition, and an evangelist from another state was called in to try to counteract the influence of our meetings. One morning, this visiting evangelist announced by radio that he would expose Seventh-day Adventists at the meeting that evening. 2 members of our evangelistic company attended his meeting. They arrived as some pictures were being shown, but almost immediately it was apparent that something was wrong, that something had happened to the pastor and the evangelist. When the evangelist stood up to speak, he seemed confused and ill. He simply read a few scriptures and sat down, never mentioning Seventh-day Adventists. The next day it was learned that when our 2 men entered, the speakers on the platform recognized them. They and half the congregation saw not 2 men, but 6. The other 4 were burly men, and the ministers were afraid of what might happen if Adventists were mentioned. Strangely enough, the other half of the congregation saw only our 2 men. Many of those present that evening were convinced that angels of God had intervened, and 22 of them, by actual count, were present at our next SDA meeting. Opposition to truth is no problem for God, nor does it take him by surprise. Whatever the emergency, whatever the difficulty, he has a way prepared to meet it, and his timing is never wrong. Jack Circle, then an assistant chaplain at one of our hospitals, was approached late one day by a businessman, a member of the church, who said he was in trouble. Jack said, "Let's go to my office and pray about it." The businessman explained that he desperately needed money to meet his payroll. He would have the money in a week, but the payroll was coming up the next day. "How much do you need?" Jack asked. And he said, "I need $24,700. That was a lot of money to pray about. Jack gave him the telephone number of someone who might be able to help with a much smaller amount, but that didn't solve the problem. Jack opened his Bible and read, "My God shall supply all your need." Philippians 4 and verse 19. The 2 men knelt together and in faith claimed that promise. Then Jack had to leave for prayer meeting, and the businessman went home. He tried the number Jack had given him, but received no answer. It seemed there was no way out of his dilemma. Then the telephone rang. The call was from a friend in the northern part of the state. He said, "30 minutes ago, I was impressed that you needed money." And the astonished man said, "30 minutes ago, Jack Circle and I were kneeling in his office, claiming the promise, 'My God shall supply all your need.'" The friend said he had sold some equipment for $21,700 and had $3,000 in his safe. He would send the full amount immediately. Needless to say, the parties on both ends of that call were deeply impressed. The friend who called was a doctor. He was also an atheist. He said later, "Any God who uses me to answer a prayer, I want to know." Would it be wrong to suggest that God and his angels must have fun working out our problems in such refreshingly unexpected ways? Pine Springs Ranch was running out of water. 200 juniors had used a lot of water. Family camp, now in progress, was using much less. But the tanks supplied by nearby mountain wells were not filling up. They were almost empty. If it did not rain very, very soon, the camp would have to close after a season of only 2 weeks. Those present at family camp prayed earnestly for rain. The next day, clouds gathered and a few drops fell, not enough to change the situation at all. Friday evening, after campfire, the campers gathered for prayer again. Why had God not answered their prayers? Should they be more specific? Should they set a time limit? Should they ask God to send rain by Monday morning? Would that be faith or presumption? They decided they should not tell God how to answer their prayers, but simply leave the matter in His hands. In that spirit, they prayed. As soon as they arose from their knees, some ran to check the tanks as they had been doing every few hours. The others were saying goodnight to each other, and suddenly a shout rang out over the camp. "Water! There's water in the tanks!" Now those last to leave the prayer circle raced to the tanks. Even as they ran, they could hear the sound of flowing water. Someone shouted, "The tanks are full and running over." 5 hours earlier, those tanks were empty. Now they were full and running over. Evidently, rain is not the only way God can fill water tanks. The Seventh-day Adventist Elementary School in Vacaville, California, had just been remodeled. That is, it had been remodeled except for shingles. Funds had run just that much short, and the need was serious, for the rainy season was approaching. The smaller children in Kay Buzelli's room had memorized the words of Jesus. With men, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. And they believed these words were true. For days, they had prayed for shingles. And earlier that September morning in Bible class, Karen had prayed, "Dear Jesus, please be with us today. Help us to do something to show we love others. And please, dear God, don't forget to take care of our school." And then it happened. The freeway was only a stone's throw away, and suddenly there was a great boom as a giant truck tire blew out. 17 frightened children looked up to see the big truck swerve into the path of oncoming traffic. But those little people, believe it or not, did not race outside or even to the window to see what was happening. One of them said, "Let's pray that no one will be hurt." And 17 children knelt in a circle with their teacher and prayed, while the screeching, thumping, bumping, crashing sounds of a serious accident continued. Their prayer was answered, even as they prayed. The big truck had turned over and dumped its contents on the edge of the freeway. A smaller truck, in which a 2-year-old boy was riding with his father, had turned over and landed in the creek beside the school, but there were no serious injuries. Even the newspapers called it a miracle. But wait, what had the big truck dumped on the edge of the freeway? Shingles. Shingles just the color needed for the school. Shingles strewn everywhere it seemed, and nobody wanted to pick them up. A school board member was at the school at the time, and he negotiated with the insurance adjuster to buy them all for a very small sum. The children picked them up and stacked them neatly. The roof was cared for before the rains, and the shingles left over were sold for a profit of $300. Could anyone tell those Vacaville children that God doesn't answer prayer? Dave and his wife Grace were awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of the doorbell. Who could it be? Dave made his way down to the front door. There was no one there. Looking up and down the street, he saw a man standing in front of the neighbor's house looking back at him. Then the man walked down the street and disappeared. The next night at 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang again. Dave was more cautious this time. He left the night chain latched and just cracked the door. "Who is there?" And a male voice answered. "I'm looking for John Smith. Does he live here?" And Dave said, "No, I'm sorry, he doesn't live here. Good night." He didn't know if it was the same person as the night before, but of course he suspected that it was. For several nights, neither Dave nor Grace slept well. Their collie dog, kept in the backyard, barked more than usual. Once Dave looked out and saw a man dressed like the one he had seen the first night. 5 or 6 uneasy nights passed, and they were getting more jumpy with each succeeding night. Friday morning, they discovered that a window had broken out during the night. All the first floor windows had bars, but blinds on this window coming between the bars and the window pane would have prevented a prowler from seeing the bars. Concern now showed on their faces as they hurried the children off to school. Dave picked up the children that afternoon. As he turned into the driveway, he saw a man dressed like the one he had seen walking toward their house. He let the children out and told them to go into the house immediately. Then he walked around to the front to confront the man. But the man had seen him and was now 5 or 6 houses down the street. What could he do? He had no proof it was the same man. What could he be arrested for? Dave, not wanting to alarm Grace, told her he had a few more visits to make and would be back in an hour. About 30 minutes later, Grace heard the back door open and someone come in. She thought Dave had forgotten something and went to see if she could help. To her horror, she was standing face to face with a strange man. He said, "Hi, how are y'all?" but stopped where he was. Grace, exhibiting a cool that she did not feel, said, "I'm just fine." Then she walked deliberately toward him. Taken by surprise, he backed out the door and she locked it. She was in a state of near panic. So what could Dave and Grace do? The man was gone now, and there were probably many men dressed in a black hat and black topcoat. That evening, after the children were in bed, they prayed earnestly that angels would protect them. The collie dog barked again that night. Dave saw the same man walking away. Then everything was quiet. Sabbath morning they awoke a little late, having lost so much sleep. Instantly Grace said, "Dave, I smell cigarette smoke. Someone has been in this house." Dave smelled it too and investigated. Someone had been in the house. Someone was still there, lying on the stairs. Dave called the police. We have an intruder in our house. He's lying on the stairs. I don't know if he's drunk, asleep, sick, or dead, but please hurry." Nervously they waited. What would happen now? Would the man come upstairs? Was he dead? The minutes seemed like hours. When the patrol car drove up, Dave opened the door for the officer. "There's the man, lying up there on the stairway. He must be either drunk or drugged to go to sleep on the stairs like that." The officer pointed his flashlight at the man. "That man is not asleep. He's wide awake." Then to the man, "This is the police. Stand up. Put your hands behind your back." He stood up, was handcuffed, and taken away. The man confessed that he had been staking out the house for about 2 months. He wouldn't say why. He said he had been upstairs looking into the bedrooms when he heard Dave and Grace began to wake up. He started down the stairs, and then for some reason he didn't know, he lay down on the stairs and stayed there until the officer told him to get up. The police were amazed. They couldn't understand. But Dave and Grace and the children do not think it's so strange. They believe that the Lord commanded him to lie down and that the angels kept him there until the officers arrived. That account was more than a nutshell, wasn't it? Then there is the story of Jim, who, without realizing it, carried a pocket calculator he had been looking at out of a store along with his purchases. When he got to the car, he tossed his packages onto the front seat, and one of them slid to the floor. As he bent over to pick it up, he saw the calculator underneath it. To anyone looking on, of course, it would appear that he was trying to hide it. And someone was looking on. Just at that moment, the store owner opened the car door and demanded that he get out. He was arrested for shoplifting. This was a serious blow. Jim and his family were new in the city. Nobody knew him. His job and his reputation were at stake. It was the next day before he could get up courage to tell Janine what had happened. "It was so stupid," he said. "So stupid." He felt he had to plead guilty. After all, the calculator was in his possession when he was arrested. No one would be concerned about whether he meant to take it or not. He was called before the judge the next Friday, and the charges were read. There were the usual formalities, but when the judge asked if he had anything to say, he explained what had happened. The judge interrupted. "Just a minute. Are you trying to say that you did not intend to take this calculator?" "No, I did not, Your Honor." "Then I can't accept your plea of guilty. This case will have to be held over for trial in a criminal court." The trial was set for November 20. Jim and Janine were praying constantly these days, praying as they had never prayed before. The trial was on a Thursday. 6 witnesses testified against Jim. Then his lawyer called for a recess and told Jim he could get him off on a technicality. None of the witnesses could prove it was the same calculator. Jim didn't want that. And then the judge had to leave to catch a plane. Court was adjourned until the next Tuesday. Jim and Janine kept praying. Janine fasted for 1 day. All that mattered was that she must be right with God. Otherwise, how could he hear her prayers? Then she experienced a calm and a peace she had not known before. On Tuesday, all the judge had to do was sum up his findings and give his verdict. But something was added. The judge had a story to tell of what had happened to him on Saturday. Shopping in the Redlands shopping center, he made several purchases and looked at a number of other items. As he was getting into his car, he suddenly realized he had accidentally picked up an item and brought it out with him. "If I had been stopped then," he told the lawyers, "I would have been in exactly the same predicament as this man." And then, not guilty. Case dismissed. Angels must have wept tears of joy along with Jim and Janine. But I must tell you one more. 3 little girls, and 3 little girls who were visiting them, suddenly decided they wanted to get the Shetland pony and take turns riding. There was no reason they shouldn't ride, except that the pony was out in the south pasture running with some yearling steers. And this particular pony loved her freedom. She could run faster than most Shetlands and knew every trick of escape. It took 2 well-mounted men to bring her in. The father who owned the horse explained to the girls that he couldn't bring her in alone, and he tried to suggest something else they might do. But after a hurried conference, the 6 little girls just dropped to their knees and began to pray. The problem to them was so simple. God could bring the pony in. It was a sight to remember. 6 little girls, with their heads together, praying so earnestly. The father was almost moved to join them, but he wondered if it might not be a sacrilege to pray for a range-running horse to come home, and it seemed so futile. He was about to tell them that one doesn't ask God for such things, when he looked up and saw the pony coming on the run, down the butte, across the flat, through the creek, and into the corral, where she stopped and waited. The girls by now were up from their knees and waiting for her. They weren't even surprised. They just ran for her with cries of joy, got her bridled, and took off for an afternoon of riding. The father of the visiting girls was absolutely shaken. His face was white. He said to his host, "It seems it's not what you pray for, but who does the praying." He had just seen 6 little girls blast every rule of horsemanship. He wouldn't have believed the story if it had been told him, but he had seen it and couldn't forget. He began reading his Bible and then attending church with his family. He has since held several offices in the church. Before witnessing what happened that day, religion had meant nothing to him, but his faith is now unshakable. Could the same be said of your faith now? If not, why? The end of chapter 14 of It Must Have Been an Angel.